Credit to Dr. Greg Gom. I don't know if any of you know him. Greg is a physician in Denver who's been president of the Colorado Medical Directors Association many times. He is one of the main medical directors for a group of nursing homes under the name of Vivage, and they have a bunch of nursing homes in the Denver metro area. And he really does a great job of keeping track of flu statistics, other virus statistics, and allowed me to use his slides for today, which is lovely. So I'm going to use those. I'm going to be doing a fair amount of reading. They're a little bit busy, but they get the message across. So here we go with slide number 1. So, so what we're talking about with the new coronavirus vaccines is they're called mRNA or messenger RNA vaccines. The old types of vaccines, which still exist and are still used quite a lot, and in fact will still be coming as COVID vaccines, but they take much longer. And the way that they've worked is that the virus had to be cultured, had to be grown, which is a difficult and lengthy process, and then killed and or inactivated. And then pulling the proteins basically out of the dead virus material, putting that into saline, and then injecting that into people's bodies. There's actually many ways to create vaccines in that manner, but all of them take a great deal of time. The two new vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, are both messenger RNA. And I did a little presentation last week or the week before at our town hall meeting, I think it was, trying to give some visuals, some graphics, some more details about how mRNA gets turned into protein. But what's really important about these new mRNA vaccines is they don't contain any live virus. In fact, they really don't contain any of an original virus at all. They just contain the mRNA particles. So there's no risk that they can actually cause COVID. They contain the mRNA strands that are actually encased in a lipid or a fat coating. And that protects it and allows it to get inside of cells, and then the cells know to actually open that up, almost like a package, and then translate that mRNA or transcribe it into proteins. The particles inside the cells that make proteins are called ribosomes. The actual protein that we're interested in and that is coded for by this mRNA is the spike proteins that you all saw up in the left-hand corner there. Once the cell makes the spike proteins, they're pushed out of the cell, either on the cell or into the bloodstream. And then our immune cells, in this case, T lymphocytes, recognize this protein as foreign, make antibodies to it, and hopefully when we contact the actual virus, it sees those spike proteins and attacks the virus and shuts it down. The shots are incredibly effective. The FDA requires 50%, greater than 50% efficacy. And they measure this by having some people who are vaccinated with a control or a placebo, and they see how many people get sick who got the placebo and compare that to people who actually had the real vaccine. The other nice thing about these vaccines is that they are very safe. So they know that from all vaccines that if somebody's going to have a bad reaction to it, it mostly occurs in the first 6 to 8 weeks. So they've been doing really intensive observation of people for the first 8 weeks after they've gotten the vaccine. And that's ongoing, but all of this happened before they got the emergency use authorization. So they vaccinated over 3,000 people initially. Probably many of you know that when a vaccine adverse event occurs, we report that to the VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. So they keep track of negative outcomes, adverse events, and that's where all this gets recorded at this point. There have been over 500,000 people in studies and phase 3 trials around the world, in 13 different studies at least. And so here are some of the results of those first studies. This was a study on 67,000 people, and this was as of about a month ago, 5 weeks ago. And you see that first line, people who got COVID. In the placebo group, about 350 got the disease, and then the vaccine group, 19 got the vaccine. And that is about a 20-to-1 ratio. So 1/20th is 5%, and that's where they come up with the number 95% effective. Which is amazing. Most of our vaccines are, we think, probably 70 to 80% effective. 95% is knocking it out of the park. And then on the next line, which is also amazing, people who got severe COVID disease requiring hospitalization or that killed them, in the placebo group, was 39. Actually, only one of them died, but 39 people were hospitalized with severe infection. And in the vaccine group, one required hospitalization. And that is a 40-to-1 ratio, which means that the vaccine is 97.5% effective at preventing severe disease or death, which again is pretty amazing. I'm going to leave some time for questions at the end, so I don't know if people are having questions come up, but we'll have a chance to address some questions at the end of this. There are 2 advisory committees. One advises the FDA and one advises the CDC. The ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, is the one that advises CDC, and Vaccine-Related Biological Products Advisory Committee advises the FDA. These are independent organizations. They're mostly staffed by academics at institutions who have no conflicts of interest. And they make recommendations to these organizations based on the efficacy and safety. What is an emergency use authorization? The FDA has the ability to grant an EUA based on a need for an urgent health crisis. It isn't always for a vaccine. There are other medications that have gotten EUAs in the past. And in fact, like remdesivir, which isn't a vaccine, it's actually a treatment for hospitalized patients with COVID, also has an EUA, meaning they haven't gone through all of the steps of FDA approval, which takes a minimum generally of 2 years or more. So the EUA process is much shorter. They don't skip any steps, but they accelerate each of the phases of approval. So this takes weeks rather than months or years. So they still go through clinical trials. They still have to submit a request for FDA approval, and then the FDA grants an EUA, and then ongoing trials continue, which is some of the data that I was showing you, and eventually these vaccines will incredibly likely, almost certainly, be completely FDA approved. Those advisory boards that I mentioned review all of the data and then give their recommendations to the FDA and the CDC. Questions have been raised: should the people who've had COVID actually be vaccinated? And all of the data show that the vaccine is safe for those who've had the disease, but the recommendation is to wait until after you recover from the disease, at least 2 weeks. And actually some organizations recommend waiting 90 days, which is very reasonable because the expectation is that if you've had COVID, you will be immune for a period of time, and then the immunization can act as boosters for you. So the vaccine adds to their immunity. And what is herd immunity? Maybe you've heard of herd immunity, but it's basically when enough people are immune, either they've had the disease or they've been vaccinated, that the vaccine, the disease therefore is having difficulty spreading because there just aren't enough people who can get the disease anymore to get it and spread it to more people who haven't had it. And so that cutoff is somewhere around 70%. Some say as high as 80%. But if we just let everybody get the disease, it would take years. And some of the issues that go with that are that over the years, the virus can mutate and then be virulent to people who have already been immune from past infection. And that's kind of what you see with influenza, right? And that's why we have to get vaccinated every year, because influenza is incredibly good at mutating and becoming virulent to people who already had it or got vaccinated the year before. So we're hoping to have enough vaccine by this fall to get 70 to 80% of the population immune, whether that's through vaccination or through already having had it. So when is somebody immune? So they're saying a week after the second dose of the 2 vaccines that we've discussed already, Pfizer and Moderna, or 2 weeks after the vaccines made the traditional way, which they think might be coming out as soon as springtime. That'll be about 1.5 years. So it's still an accelerated process, but quicker than the typical 2-year turnaround time. So we know that you can still get COVID for a month to month and a half after the first vaccine. So we urge people to keep wearing masks, keep staying distant, probably even after that. What they don't know yet, and they still haven't been able to solve completely, is if I am immune, the way the immunity works is the virus can get in you and get deactivated by the antibodies, but is there a chance that you could still spread it in the meantime? So that's the concern. You could be an asymptomatic spreader. The chances of that are probably low, but they just don't know the answers yet. So continue to wear masks, socially distance, and ask others to do so. What are the side effects? Typically, people will have headache, muscle pains, fatigue, fever. arm pain, injection site pain. And they're saying that happens to 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 people. I'm guessing it's going to be more than that from people that I've talked to who've gotten the shot. But these are signs that the immune system is responding. They say that once you have these side effects, they tend to last a day or two. The second dose might produce more vigorous immune response. It is a booster, so we expect the immune system to be responding more vigorously. So you might have slightly more symptoms or side effects from the second one. There have been 0 serious side effects. There have been no deaths. So even with discomfort or side effects, it's important to get your second dose. And it's important that that second dose be the same vaccine. So Pfizer and Pfizer, Moderna and Moderna, they are somewhat different, and they don't have any evidence to believe that having one the first time and the second time will work. So please get the second one that's the same. There have been rare allergic responses. The initial 2 reported in the UK were in people who had severe allergic reaction history and actually carry EpiPen with them. They survived. They recovered within a couple of days. There have been 13 million doses with all the clinical trials and everything. So they think that allergic reactions are going to happen in 1 to 50 to 100,000 people. As I said, there haven't been any deaths. So to date, 100% have recovered. They think with vaccines in general, about 1 in 1.4 million people vaccinated will have an allergic reaction. And that's why people are instructed to stay at their doctor's office. If you have a history of allergic reactions, then stay at least 30 minutes. UC Health so far is still requiring only 15 minutes. And that probably is fine, but you should also feel free, if you're worried, to stick around for 20 to 30 minutes. At some point, they may extend the full requirement to everybody to 20 to 30 minutes, but at least as of Friday or Sunday night, when I got my second vaccine, it was still 15 minutes. This is, can you get COVID after getting a vaccine? The immunity, as we said before, takes several weeks. We think there's some immunity after the first dosage, but you don't have that 95% immunity until, they say 2 weeks. Now they're lowering that down to 1 week after the second vaccine is given. And not everybody will be 100% immune. That's the 95% efficacy rate. So 1 in 20 people can still get COVID, but we know that those people will almost certainly have a much less severe course. And as we said, only have a 1/40th chance of being hospitalized if they do get it, compared to not getting it, the vaccine. So people can be, well, what I want to say is people might have the disease when they get vaccinated, or be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. So they'll then get the vaccine and then have COVID, and it's not because the vaccine caused it. And this is the same with the flu vaccine at this point, because the flu vaccine doesn't cause the flu. It's the same issues. So yes, that does happen. It's unusual, but it absolutely can still happen. And then it looks like the person got the disease from the vaccine, but that can't happen. And this vaccine is only for COVID-19. The one interesting thing as a sidelight, because mRNA particles are actually very small, they're thinking that in the future they'll be able to combine several vaccines, particularly if these end up being something we need to get every year or two. They could be combined potentially with the influenza vaccines in the future once they start making mRNA influenza vaccines. Let's see, I guess other things can happen. There have been people who've gotten the vaccine and then had pneumonia or a stroke or a heart attack, but these don't happen any more frequently than the general population, so they don't think they're at all related. So people have asked, like, how did this vaccine get developed so quickly? And basically, there are several miracles of science at work here that technology has been working in the background forever. And so we have the ability to sequence genes, DNA and RNA. There are these, machines, these CRISPR type machines around the world. And so they were able to sequence the entire RNA genome within 6 weeks of clarifying what the virus was. And then they were able to figure out what is the RNA splice, the one small part of RNA that codes for the spike protein. So that's what they've used to make the vaccine. So this technology was in place when COVID hit. And so at least these two companies, Pfizer, and I forget the other company that was working, I think it was BioNTech, and Moderna, had this ability, and they just weren't sure what disease they should go after. And then COVID popped its head up, and they knew this was their big opportunity to make a splash on the world stage. So that's what's happening. So the emergency use authorization allowed all vaccine makers to move to the front of the line, to move things quickly, so hopefully less people would die. Governments purchased 100 million, or I guess that's 1 billion doses of vaccine in advance. And the reason this was important is because if you're developing a new drug and you're taking a financial risk, you may not make as much of it or put as much research and development into it. But in this case, these were pre-bought, and that allowed these companies to go ahead and make lots of vaccines so we could get more people vaccinated quickly. Is it going to be mandatory? No, certainly not at this point. Because it's not technically FDA approved through the full process, like the flu vaccine is, very few people are requiring it. Care Synergy is not requiring it. But the reality is, if you go for natural vaccination by actually getting the disease, you put yourself at much higher risk, your families, and our patients. Should there be incentives to get the vaccine? Yes, absolutely. And the incentive is that you may save your life or somebody else's life. And you can also prevent long-term complications. So as you have heard, COVID causes a lot of inflammation. Inflammation causes strokes. Inflammation causes heart attacks, pneumonia, pulmonary emboli, blood clots, and other parts of the body. And these are some of the long-term complications that people are suffering with. So by not getting the disease, you reduce your risk of having all of those things. Should pregnant women get vaccinated? There's actually not good data on this. Several women were pregnant when they got vaccinated in the studies, and there haven't been any serious side effects. There was a rumor a few weeks ago that women would be at increased risk of miscarriage. The spike protein shares several thousand base pairs in similarity to a protein that helps make up the placenta. So there was some thought that the immune system would then attack the placenta early on in pregnancy, and that has not borne out in practice. So they're saying common sense is, you know, mom and baby would be safer if they got the vaccine rather than the infection. But again, there's not data at this point to absolutely support that. Can I quit wearing a mask? And the answer is not yet. After you've had your vaccination, we need to wait until we get to that realm of herd immunity. So 70 to 80% of people immune in the community. For kids, so far the vaccine is approved only for 16 and up. Both companies that are making the mRNA vaccine on the market that's available now are trying to expand their reach down to 12-year-olds and up. So they're still working on that. For seniors and nursing home patients, lots of older people were vaccinated in the studies, and they're finding almost exactly the same efficacy, 94 versus 95%. They didn't test them specifically in that group, but they're finding that people, yes, are getting immune. And in Colorado, we've moved over age 70 people into the 1A group. So we're getting older people vaccinated quicker. Are there any racial, I guess, disparities in terms of response? And the answer is no. A third of the participants in the clinical studies were people of color, and there was no difference in efficacy or side effects. How long will immunity last? We're hoping it's at least a year. Different reports have been coming out saying 2 years or longer. We just don't know yet. So that's something that time will tell. There haven't been outbreaks in the places where the, or new outbreaks in the places where the virus initially showed up. So that's good news. So that's why they're thinking it'll last longer than a year. But people are thinking we may need a booster after a year or 2 or 3 or 4. We just don't know yet. So why should you be vaccinated? How many people in the world have had COVID? 91 million. How many of those people have died from COVID? 2 million. How many people have had long-term complications that we talked about? Heart damage, kidney damage, stroke, etc. The same amount that have died, 2 million. So you're as likely to live and have long-term complications as you are to die from it. And how many people in the world have been vaccinated? At this point, 26 million. How many people have had serious long-term adverse effects from the vaccine? 0. And how many people have died from the vaccine? 0. Vaccine is safe. The disease can kill you or cause long-term complications. It is effective. It's amazingly effective. So there's not even a way to think that getting the disease is better for you. So we recommend you get the vaccine as soon as you can. And also, there are no GPS trackers in the vaccine placed there by Bill Gates, just so you know. And that is it.